Hello, I'm Christopher Bakken. Very happy to be participating in a Q&A for your fascinating class. I've chosen 5 questions that I'm going to answer today, and I'll try to answer them with some depth, and hopefully these answers will be useful as you've been thinking about Greek cuisine from ancient to modern moments. The first question that I'm going to choose to answer is this one. The question goes like this. I'm curious why you named your book Honey, Olives, Octopus, Adventures of the Greek Table. Are these 3 ingredients, would you consider to be the biggest components of modern Greek cuisine? Or was there some other motive for including these 3 specifically in the title? No, I don't consider these to be the 3 most crucial ingredients of Greek cuisine. Those would have to be olive oil, legumes, and barley. The 3 things really that have sustained the Greek people through periods of starvation, war, colonization, drought, poverty, and also prosperity for 3,000 years or so. But I think you'll probably agree that oil, beans, and barley wasn't a very sexy title for a book on Greek cuisine. It certainly wasn't one that my book editors were going to be interested in. The 3 elements that did wind up sort of waving a flag in the title are meant to signal a few things. First, that my book was designed to think deeply about the elements of Greek cuisine, the way individual ingredients, especially if they're sourced locally and produced with great care, really form the backbone of the Greek table. I imagine a typical meal at a friend's home or at a family restaurant on the island of Thasos and thought about the simplicity and beauty represented there and really on almost every Greek table or Greek meal. Um, bread, cheese, olives, wine, beans, and then a final garnish, usually of meat or fish. Um, my book is organized in a way that dedicates one chapter to each of those elements and really uses those elements as windows into Greek history, sociology, culture, ethnography. Um, Secondly, I think the title Honey, Olives, Octopus is meant to emphasize the fact that real culinary joy and adventure can be unlocked actually by appreciating both the simplicity and the variety of Greek products. My solemn duty when I was writing this book, you can imagine the misery of my research project, was to travel around Greece cooking and eating with Greek grandmothers mainly. I'm wandering from farm to farm, stable to stable, wood oven to wood oven, trying to decide what the single best olive or the single best cheese was in all of Greece, according to my opinion. Those are the various reasons we ended up with Honey, Olives, Octopus, rather than, you know, alternate other titles. Um, Second question. Can we speak of one Greek diet? Or are there widely varying food cultures in different parts of the country? I'm thinking about the islands versus the mainland, north versus south, etc. It's a great question. I can answer it in one sentence, but then I will elaborate. We cannot speak of one Greek diet. So it's certainly helpful to think of Greek cuisine through its basic elements, as I try to do in my book. But it's also crucial to appreciate how those elements differ from region to region. Greece is a tiny country. In landmass, it's actually smaller than the state of Wisconsin, the state where I was born. My grandfather used to remind me about this all the time. But there's also 10,000 miles of seaside coastland. There are densely forested mountain regions in places like Epirus. There are landscapes of nothing but stone in places like the Cycladic Islands. There are dense agricultural niches like the Pelion Peninsula, where so much of the fruit of Greece is grown. And there are even the wide grain growing plains of Thessaly, where bread and barley and grains have been produced there for thousands of years. Which is to say, for a tiny country, Greece is actually incredibly vast. On top of all this natural, of course, and geographical variety, by virtue of the fact that Greece has been conquered, absorbed, um, colonized for thousands of years means that its cuisine really has absorbed outside influences from every compass direction. From the Ottoman Empire on the east, from the Slavic and Italian coming down from the north, and also from the African and Egyptian coming from the south. So, while the ancient Greeks spread their influence and culture across all these regions, modern Greece has actually absorbed all those influences back into itself. All those cultures and cuisines are part of what we now call Greek cuisine. I think the concept of terroir is helpful here. Terroir is a wine term invented by the French, and it works something like this. If you take um, a root of Cabernet Sauvignon, one of the great grape varietals, and you broke that root into pieces and you planted one vine in South Africa, one vine in Bordeaux, one vine in California, one in Wisconsin where it would promptly freeze to death and die. Okay, um, or one in let's say Australia. Why is it that you would have five remarkably different wines? And the answer is terroir. It has to do with climate, uh, the soil itself, but also human interventions, the way the vines are treated, the way they're farmed, the way they're irrigated, and also then the way the final wine itself is produced in barrels or stainless steel, how long it's aged, etc. So terroir helps us explain the differences, even in a simple culinary ingredient, how it can be so wildly various. And the terroirs of Greece are remarkably variegated, in fact. There are so many microclimates and micro traditions in Greece that really every 50 miles you drive or every 10 miles you walk, you actually might find a different way of treating the same dish or the same ingredients. The wonderful British travel writer Patrick Lee Fermer has this quote about Greece, which I love very much. He calls Greece an inexhaustible Pandora's box of eccentricities and exceptions to every conceivable rule. An inexhaustible Pandora's box of eccentricities and exceptions to all conceivable rule. And that goes for the Greek people, and it also goes for Greek cuisine. Question number 3. Uh, there are often many misconceptions and stereotypes on what the ancient Greeks actually ate or what food is actually Greek. Mhm. Do any of these assumptions have a real effect on the way Greeks think about food today in modern Greece? It's a juicy question. This one actually hints at the politics of food and the way that those politics are lived in a small Balkan country like Greece. In fact, it's a reminder that everything in the Balkans is political. So, like any Balkan nation at the crossroads of so much conflict and colonization, the Greeks work very hard to define themselves and their culture as a distinct ethnicity. So, at the heart of Greekness, or the ethos of Greekness, philotimo, is a fighting spirit, a fierce streak of defiant independence, but also wiliness, adaptability, openness, those things that made the hero Odysseus famous. Um, by the way, those are the traits of people who survive, and the Greeks are some of the greatest examples we have of people who survive. But what it actually means to be Greek is a very complicated thing. I think the word xenos might be helpful to toss into the conversation here. So the word xenos, which means both foreigner, stranger, and guest, um, turns out to be a really complicated term. Zeus Xenios, one of the epithets of the god Zeus, was Zeus who was in the care of strangers, foreigners, and guests, which means to betray or mistreat people like that meant you were messing with, the big one. So on the one hand, the Greeks invented xenophobia, which is a fear or distrust of strangers. But on the other hand, you have the ethos, or maybe even the religion, of what the Greeks call philoxenia, friendship to strangers, guests, foreigners. The sort of codes of hospitality that have been ritualized and treated almost with religious fervor, really since Homeric times. Um, that means that Greeks have historically welcomed outsiders, foreigners, and strangers, have fed them, and have also absorbed what they have to offer. Um, would use the city of Thessaloniki as one of the great examples, which was called the Mother of Jerusalem. It had the largest population of Jewish people outside Palestine for almost 500 years. So, this is part of the complication, even this little concept of xenos. Every once in a while, you'll see some article, usually by a Greek newspaper, and these are all kind of ridiculous articles, that they've discovered real Greek DNA. Like the scientists have proved the Greeks, you know, are the Greeks, uh, or any other real Greek or that. Unfortunately, as with nationalism anywhere, and that includes the United States of America, of course, that kind of boasting on what constitutes real, authentic Greekness or Americanness usually amounts to a fable. So, of course, what the Greeks call Greek coffee is, of course, a kind of coffee the Ottoman Turks invented and brought to Greece. And baklava and kataifi, the great sweets of Greece, are, of course, found throughout the Levant all the way to places like Jordan. Um, so here's the thing, and I'm finally, I think, trying to answer the question. The human beings who now inhabit the modern state that we call Greece have maintained a really deep seated linguistic and cultural connection back to the place that we call ancient Greece. Mhm. Um, they, of course, have also absorbed so much metaphorical DNA from other cultures that what's much more interesting to me is not whether modern Greece is ancient Greek still or whether what's Greek is Greek. But what's interesting to me, to be honest, is how, and most Greeks acknowledge this pretty openly, is how Greek cuisine in particular has absorbed all of these influences and confluences and has actually made them better in almost every case. And made them their own in the process, but have also managed to improve upon them. Here's one case in point. I have a great friend in the city of Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, of course, who liked to remind me that the eating of mezedes, those are the little plates that make up the bulk of Greek dining, you'll have 20 at a meal. He said that's actually an Ottoman or urban Constantinople style of dining. He said, which is to say that the Turks invented this, but he always said, if you really want to eat the best mezedes in the world, you have to go to Greece. In fact, you have to go to Thessaloniki. Uh, a fine example, I think, of that. Question number 4. I know a bit about Greek distilled spirits, ouzo, tsiporo, and how they're traditionally made. Are the name brand bottles produced and marketed in bulk any good? Or is there no comparison with the small batch stuff that you might come across in a small taverna or by being invited into a local friend's house? I'm glad to hear one of you is thirsty. I love this question because it makes me thirsty, in fact. If you read Honey Olive's Octopus, you'll see that the epilogue to that book, the final mini chapter, is my last act of adventure in Greece is to go and make tsiporo on the island of Thasos in a completely illegal elephantine still up in the mountains that's at least 200 years old. In places, and this is true of much of Greece now, where much of the economy is now based on tourism, the seasons work like this. In the spring and summer months, you're busy preparing the business for the invasion of the tourists and to feeding and watering the tourists and take care of them. By the time the tourists leave in October, autumn is dedicated really to agriculture, harvesting the family's olives, picking the family's grapes, storing food for winter, putting the fishing boat up, locking things down, in other words, for the hibernation period. And that brings you to winter, which is the season of drinking. Um, what you do really for rest and relaxation in the winter on an island like Thasos, you go from house to house, dining with family and friends, and sampling one another's booze. Um, Almost every family, but sometimes also every man in every family. So my friend Tassos makes his father makes his uncle makes his own, his cousin, also named Tassos, also has his own recipe. They all have their own individual recipe for tsiporo, and of course, each one of them boasts, naturally, that their tsiporo is the best tsiporo that's ever been consumed by human beings. The cleanest, the most tasty, etc. So you really wander from house to house debating whose tsiporo is the best. These are great occasions, of course, for singing, dancing, ridiculousness. Ouzo, on the other hand, is essentially a fully licensed, legal, and mass produced version of these other kinds of products. And much of it is actually very, very, very good. Um, a lot of tavernas today will stock actually 20 or 30 different kinds of ouzo because a lot of people have their specific brand or they're really interested in introducing them friends to an obscure ouzo that they've never tried before. Um, well, many of the best ouzos traditionally have come from the island of Lesbos, where they've got 5 or 6 different distilleries that have become really famous. It's actually more and more common that in Greece to find local ouzos. An ouzo really produced only in one little town or village that someone has had the ingenuity to bottle and license. And it's actually a new fad actually to break away from the lesbian ouzos and to try local ouzos instead. The same actually goes for Tsipro and Raki. Many of those now are bottled legally, and if you go to a restaurant that doesn't want to sell you illegal hooch, you can order those. Um, but to be honest, Tsipro and Raki are usually thought of as homemade products. So to be honest, many of the mass-produced spirits in Greece, though they're really good and even sometimes better than the stuff your uncle made illegally up in the hills, um, there's still a prejudice in favor of your uncle's stuff. I think the universal preference, in other words, is to honor in Greece the handmade and the local product of your host. And when I say your host, I mean either the person whose home you're dining, whose table you're dining at, or it can also be the restaurant, where if you walk into a Greek restaurant, they actually treat you like you're dining in their home. The joy of ordering siporo that the restaurant serves, the one without a label that just comes in a mysterious, out of a barrel into a mysterious vessel, um, is going to be different than the siporo you eat or you drink even at the restaurant next door. Not to mention the house wine, which is going to be different from the house wine that they happen to serve next door. So here's the reason I think that there's a prejudice in favor of the local or the homemade. It's because it's an occasion to embrace uniqueness, variety, terroir, which I mentioned before, not to mention those values of self-sufficiency and independence. So drink up. Finally, let me end with one more question. This is a doozy. What is the biggest threat to Greek food today? Both in terms of broader access, i.e., of the population to a healthy, quality diet, but also in terms of preserving traditional cuisine. It's a great question. I'm tempted to say that the biggest threat to traditional Greek food is the freezer and the big box grocery store. And here's why, though this won't actually be my answer. um, so many people, especially in the larger cities in Greece, have moved away from the consumption of whole foods, and they now live on a diet of mass produced, processed foods, not to mention fast food, in ways that really have come to resemble the diet that most of us follow in the United States, unfortunately. So that's certainly a crucial variable. When you stop eating out of the garden or out of your own olive grove, you stop knowing where your food came from, who produced it, and things go downhill pretty quickly from there. But I think there's an even more subtle shift that presents a greater danger to, to traditional ways of eating and also to health. So you've surely discovered in the readings in the course that you're taking that Greece boasts some of the best human longevity on the planet. I know you've been reading about Ikaria, and you've been reading Diane's wonderful cookbook about Ikaria and the family recipes found in that book. Ikaria is one of those so-called blue zones where people live routinely to be 100 years old. But to be honest, people all over Greece live incredibly unreasonably long lives. Um, Much of it has to do with the traditional plant-based diet. But that's not the only plant-based and olive oil diet, by the way. But that's not the only ingredient. Dan Buettner, the person who sort of invented this tagline, Blue Zones, actually says that it's not just diet that contributes to this kind of human longevity. He says there's several crucial other elements. Regular, moderate exercise, by which he means walking up the hill to the village center 3 or 4 times a day, not going to the gym and doing Stairmaster. The moderate but daily consumption of wine, especially red wine. And this is for blue zones, not just in Greece, but all over the world where people boast a lot of longevity. Um, but finally, and most crucially, the final ingredient to what it means, or the secret to living a long life, as it turns out, is to have a close knit community or group of friends with whom you share your time and your wishes and your anxieties and your worries, but also your food. So I'd honestly say that the biggest threat to Greek cuisine and traditional ways of eating and also Greek longevity is time. Here's what I mean by that. It's the ceremony of both Greek cooking and Greek dining that's under threat. So, I mean, both the super nutritional and incredibly delicious traditions of slow food, especially wood oven cooking, which involve, let's be honest, full days of doing nothing but cooking, but also the ritualized and relaxed sort of ceremonies of dwelling at a table with other human beings for hours. Hours, of course, spent appreciating the slow food that was produced for hours in the kitchen. Um, that means appreciating every bite of food and thinking of it not as fuel, as Americans tend to think of food. We put it in so we can keep going and keep working. But thinking really of every bite that you take as the very best evidence we have for both life and love. And I mean that really, even though it sounds a little trite. Um, Greeks are moving faster and faster. This is what the European market demands of them. And the appeal of fast food and mass food is obviously becoming a larger and larger temptation. But when we think of slow food, not to mention eating local and eating organic, we think of those things as fads, when in fact, that's the way Greeks have always eaten, and it's how they've always eaten, in fact, for millennia. So I believe maybe that slowing down to gather your food, to harvest your food, prepare your food, talk through your food, of course, eat your food and drink. Um, these kinds of appreciation remain really at the heart of Greek foodways. And that's part of the reason I also think it's one of the best places to eat on the entire planet. And so, as long as that slowing down can continue, I think Greece will remain one of the places where people not only live, but also love their lives much longer than other places on the planet. I'm going to stop there. I have my own final exams to attend to, and I know you're all very busy this time of year. Best of luck with the end of the semester, and thank you for the very delicious questions.